Thousands of people joined demonstrations in the UK in support of migrants and against racism. It follows days of rioting stoked by far-right groups and misinformation online. What's the public mood and has the unrest been contained? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I am Hashem Ahelbarra. Days of violence in parts of the UK stoked by racist and far-right elements led to some of the most widespread unrest seen there in years. With police stretched to the limit, there were calls for British troops to be called in. But it was an army of different kind that helped stop the riots for now. Thousands of people opposed to racism and who support refugees and migrants came out in force on Wednesday, a night when more than 100 far-right riots were expected but did not materialise. A major police crackdown has seen hundreds of arrests, some fast-tracked through courts and jail already, but an uneasy calm remains. What led to violence of such speed and scale? Could public reactions send the far-right into permanent retreat? And just how much of a factor is hostility against migrants or racism in British politics and media? We'll be discussing all this with our guests in a few moments. First, this report from Imogen Kimber.
After days of violence in towns and cities across the UK, a dramatic response. Thousands of people coming together to demonstrate against right-wing rioters and racism. Crowds protected buildings where migrants and refugees have been living.
They were going to attack this centre based on the fact that, well, it's an immigration centre. And so the community came out today to help protect the refugees here and let them know that they're welcome.
On a night when right-wing groups had urged supporters to come out onto the streets, many had feared the worst. 6,000 specialised police officers were deployed to maintain order.
We need government to show strong leadership and deal with this issue of racism once and for all. We are a multicultural, multicoloured, multifaceted society. When I see women saying, I am not going out today, when I see kids not wanting to go out to play, is this the future of Britain? No way, not on my watch.
The violence began in England and spread to Northern Ireland after a stabbing at a dance class in Southport. The attacker killed 3 children and injured another 8. Almost immediately, false claims spread online that he was an asylum seeker, that he had arrived on a small boat, and that he was a Muslim, none of which was true. Despite the police publicly correcting the facts, unrest erupted, with groups using online platforms to mobilise supporters. Prominent figures were linked to the English Defence League and their former leader, convicted criminal Tommy Robinson. The UK Prime Minister condemned the racist riots, not protests, and warned those involved would feel the full force of the law.
I was very keen that we're able to demonstrate that if you're involved in disorder, within days you'll be in the criminal justice system and some people starting long terms of imprisonment. That needs to continue.
Hundreds of arrests have already been made, with many more expected. Police are using the ample video evidence to search for suspects. Social media companies are in the spotlight, with calls for stricter laws governing hate speech and racism online. Elon Musk, owner of the platform X, has spoken out, echoing criticism by right-wing groups of policing tactics and even Keir Starmer. Some see this as Starmer's first test in government. Others see it as a test of modern, multicultural Britain. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guest from London. We're joined by Jeremy Corbyn, an independent member of Parliament and former leader of the UK Labour Party. In Leicester is Idil Osman, a lecturer at the University of Leicester, where she specialises in migration and Islamophobia. And also in London is Babu, a former Chief Superintendent in the Metropolitan Police. Thank you all for joining the programme. Jeremy, who should we blame for these riots?
I think at the one hand you blame the far right for their mobilisation and their heavy use of social media to spread lies and misinformation, and then say that they want to attack immigration lawyers and legal aid centres and places where refugees and migrant communities are assisted. But the other side of it, you have to look at several years of language which has been about blaming refugees for the social problems that Britain faces, which is actually nonsense. It is not the fault of refugees that we have a housing crisis. And then the way in which the far right are able to mobilise some degree of support. But I think what's been impressive and effective in the last few days has been the huge turnout of decent people who just say we're not tolerating this racism or this violence within our society. But it's not over yet. There are still many issues around the country on this which we have to face up to in the next few days.
Idil, that sentiment against Muslims, against immigrants is increasing in Europe and in the UK. But is it fair to say it's just the far right? Should we include the Tories? Should we include the most powerful media for hammering out the same message time and again about the threat or the supposedly existential threat of Muslims and immigrants in the West?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Hashem. Thank you, first of all, for having me. What we have is a culmination of 10 to 15 years of demonizing Muslims, demonizing migrants, using them as a punching bag for all of the ills that plagues this country, whether it is the lack of funding in public services, the lack of funding for housing, for decent accommodation, education, you name it. The last 10, 15 years of the Tory government has been an abysmal record, and they've been using migrants and Muslims to divert the public's attention away from that abysmal record. And I think when you normalize Islamophobia, when you normalize negative hatred language, it becomes an open door, essentially, for anyone who wants to attack Muslims and who wants to blame others for the problems that they're having themselves. And I want to also note that this is happening in the context of Palestine. And so there's a lot of anti-Palestinian sentiments that are also coming out when all of these criminal activities are happening on our streets.
Dal, is the police clampdown having an impact here? Do you think it will be able to contain the riots anytime soon?
Well, I think it's worth bearing in mind that this country has suffered from a huge level of austerity, where the level of policing has been cut down quite significantly. So we've lost 20,000 police officers and 18,500 police staff. The government are in the process of replacing them. So we have a very inexperienced police force at the moment. Almost a quarter of the police force across the country is basically under 5 years experience. So they have limited experience. I think the thing I would say, there's two factors that are affecting the response to the far right now. One is the sentences, which are very severe. So for violent disorder, within the space of 7 days, people are going from committing the offence to being arrested, charged, placed before the courts and sent to prison for 30 months. So it's a very, very fast system. So I think the far right demonstrators are realising that there's consequences to their behaviour. The other aspect is that the police has mobilised and has 6,000 specialist riot-trained officers who are placed strategically across the country and they respond to any kind of disorder that breaks out. So I think those factors are having a response, but I don't think we can rest on our laurels. We need to see what happens over the next few days before we can breathe a sigh of relief. I think there's been a lull, and I hope that continues, but I don't think we're out of the woods yet.
Jeremy, it all started on July 31st when the riots spread across England and parts of Northern Ireland. And you would assume, or you would think, at least for our viewers, that in Western democracy, political leaders would step in and try to calm the street, explain to people and bust some of the prevailing myths, for example, about Islam or immigrants being an existential threat to the UK. But when you look at the Tories, the far right, and the party that you led in the past, the Labour, all these parties have one thing in common. They've been pandering to the far-right voters for quite some time. Aren't they, in a way or another, all responsible for this?
You're right. All across Europe, there's been a growth of the far right. The far right have become very strong in many European countries and in Britain. Reform, for example, got 4 million votes in the recent general election. Add up the Tory and Reform vote, that's bigger than the Labour vote in the general election. The Labour vote wasn't very impressive at all. It was, in fact, lower than was achieved in 2019. Where the far right have grown in any country in Europe, the Conservative parties or equivalent Tory parties all across Europe have themselves moved to the right. The Socialist and Social Democratic parties have often then moved to the centre and all used rhetoric which is, in effect, blaming migrants. So we've had this ludicrous debate for the past 2 years in Britain at least about stopping the boats coming and blaming the people traffickers. People only get into those boats out of desperation. They're human beings trying to get to a place of safety. Those people coming from Calais are not the cause of Britain's housing shortage, education underfunding, or any of the other social problems that are a litmus test to people and their behaviour. And so Labour leaders as well have played into this by saying they will control immigration, as though immigration is the problem. They also know, when they think about it, that all across Europe there's actually falling populations and falling birth rates, and the only people that are going to provide the workforce of the future are actually migrant communities that have been very important in keeping health and social services running. And so politicians have been pandering to the far right for several years. This past 10 days they've been in absolute panic because they've seen where that pandering leads to, and at last they've started saying, actually, we've got to stand up for a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilingual society and be proud of it and work with it. And so the effect has been important. The other point I just make about the policing, very interesting and very important point. I've had a number of meetings with very senior police officers over the last few days and also talking to the police in my own community. The police actually concede that on Wednesday, the really powerful thing wasn't necessarily the policing. It was the numbers of people who in country towns and big cities all over the country came out and said, we are standing with the migrant communities, we're standing with the refugees and not going to allow these attacks to take place. And most of the newspapers who spent the last years complaining about the anti-racist campaigns, complaining about those of us that have been marching in support of Palestine and against the bombing of Gaza, suddenly found that actually the popular reaction of many people around the country has made an enormous difference. And whilst it's not over, and there's many demonstrations planned this weekend, I think there's been a very significant political turning point. No thanks to the political leaders of the past 5 years who've been blaming refugees. Every thanks to those people that just came out and said, not in our name.
Idil, when you see a country where you have the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, warning of a hurricane of migrants coming to the UK, or when the Labour Party itself, its leader, Sir Gama, talking about the need to smash the criminal boat gangs. And at the same time, you look at some of the most powerful newspapers there, the way they mischaracterize the presence of immigrants, or the way they mischaracterize immigration, the way they demonize immigrants. Are we talking about a shifting dynamic itself, some sort of a turning point in the political landscape?
That's right, Hashem. People need to realize that language has impact. And one thing that we haven't been doing enough in this country, and I say this as a media academic, is we're not scrutinizing our media enough. We have normalized the demonizing of Muslim communities. We have normalized the demonizing of migrants and scapegoating them for every problem that exists in this country. And the media had an active role to play in that. When you're giving front page coverage to someone like Boris Johnson, who's referring to Muslim women as pickaninnies and letterboxes, that is absolutely unacceptable. And it's that kind of language and media coverage of negativity that has become so normalized for the last 10, 15 years that now it is completely acceptable to attack Muslim spaces, to attack migrants. And I also want to point to the fact of, the challenge of disinformation. When this attack, this unfortunate killing of these 3 little girls took place, immediately we had a disinformation that was spread about the attacker being an illegal migrant that came last year on a dinghy and who was of the Muslim faith. And they all came out in droves. Literally, the police came out to set the record straight, to say, no, in fact, the gentleman in question was born in Cardiff, he's of Rwandan descent, and he's a Christian. That did not stop people from continuing to riot, because the biases that they already have confirmed in their heads chimes in with the disinformation. So we need to pay attention to the role of the media, particularly the role of disinformation that could be spread on social media, and hold these digital media giants accountable, as well as our mainstream UK media.
Dal, 30 years in the police, you've been trying to build bridges between the community and the police force. At the same time, you've been vocal on the need for more diversity within the Metropolitan Police. When you look at the situation unfolding, those riots, what do you think is the root cause for this? Is it racism the biggest challenge facing the British society?
Yeah, I mean, you can't discount racism. Britain always feels uncomfortable talking about racism. It feels much more comfortable talking about other types of discrimination. But when it comes to racism, it's a topic that is very, very difficult for the British people to discuss and accept that there are significant challenges around race. In terms of police force, we don't still have a chief constable who is either black or Asian, despite over 15% of the population being from minority ethnic backgrounds. So we have a predominantly white police service. But I think one of the biggest challenges that the police, and indeed all the administrations, governments have, is the social media. We have Elon Musk talking about civil war. We have the far right using the social media to organise events and spread lies. We got into the habit of talking about misinformation as a polite way of saying lies. We need to call it out for what it was. And what happened when tragically and appalling those 3 girls were murdered? Immediately, the far right started spreading lies on the internet, and the internet did not, X did not stop it, platform did not stop it. And basically what they said was that this was a Muslim. And so that then consequently led to attacks on mosques. Mosques were attacked, criminally damaged, burnt. And then we had the situation where hotels where asylum seekers were staying, were waiting for a decision. Those were attacked, and the far right, white thugs, racist thugs, then tried to burn the buildings down to kill the people inside. So, we mustn't lose sight of how serious this situation has been. And thankfully, we've had a couple of nights where, due to the massive police presence and the communities that have come out, and the sentences, I think those 3 factors all contribute. We've now had a situation where things have quieted down. We have to wait to see what the impact will be over the weekend.
Jeremy, you wrote a letter along with other MPs to the Secretary of State for the Home Office on the need for tough measures against Islamophobia and hatred speech. When you look at the history of legislation in the UK, particularly when it comes to targeting Islamophobia, hate in particular, and crimes against immigrants, the UK had some of the... It had led the continent in the 60s and the 70s when it comes to those legislations. Why is it now lagging far behind? What is the problem, do you think?
I think Britain needs to face up to the fact that there is a serious racist problem in the country, that there are systemic levels still of discrimination, and the point made about the lack of senior police officers from black and minority ethnic backgrounds, the lack of any chief constable from those backgrounds, and even in London, where a much higher proportion than the rest of the country come from black and minority ethnic backgrounds, then we want to see some changes there. But there is also this question of systemic Islamophobia, much of which is not reported to the police because the victims of it, often Muslim women who suffer abuse on the streets, on the buses, on the trains, don't report it, so it goes as unreported. Therefore, the issue is not taken as seriously as it should be by the police as a whole. And the way in which there's a constant denigration of people of Muslim faith and Islam. There is a big concentration on opposing anti-Semitism in society, and that's right. Anti-Semitism is a totally evil cult in exactly the same way that Islamophobia is an evil cult. And so we do have to be much stronger in supporting the diversity of our communities, diversity of our faith, but also recognise that the feeding ground of the fascists, of the far right, as in Germany before the Second World War, was always saying to people who were up against it and poor, needing better jobs, needing better services, needing better housing, that they hear the language of blame against migrants, saying we can't cope, there's too many migrants, rather than looking at the issues of inequality within our society. And so it is about opposing racism in every form. It is about supporting the communities that are under attack and threat today, the Muslim community, but it's also about dealing with economic and social inequality in our society. And sadly, the economic proposals put forward so far by Sir Keir Starmer's government have not sought to address any of that.
Idil, when you look at high-profile anti-Muslim activists like Tommy Robinson, the way they've been characterising this as a hard-working family fight against the political establishment, are we seeing here a new pattern in British politics, which is basically far-right shaping the narrative?
I think it's the spread of populism across Europe that, is affecting the politics in the UK as well. And unfortunately, what we tend to see, if we take a sort of broader historical view in terms of Western politics, is whenever there is a high level of inequality, social inequality, economic inequality, poor housing, poor resources available for social services, whenever there's a big crisis that affects the economy, we've had Brexit here, we've had COVID, we've had the Ukraine-Russia crisis and conflict that's been going on for years now. All of that tends to create an environment that looks for easier scapegoats by the political leaders because they don't have the competence or the capability or the will sometimes to deal with these massive big problems that Jeremy Corbyn just highlighted. Instead, they look for easy ways to divert the public's attention from all of these big problems. And unfortunately, blaming Muslims, blaming the migrant community has become the go-to, not just here in the UK by people like Nigel Farage and Tommy Robinson, but we've seen that across Europe. And I think it's that issue that really needs to be tackled. We need to face that hard and say, don't divert our attention. We know what the problems are, face with it and lead with integrity.
Dal, what would be the main challenges facing the police force in the upcoming days if the riots continue?
I just want, if I can just make one point. In
Briefly,
this country,
please, yes.
we do not have a definition of Islamophobia. And I think there's been several attempts to try and get a definition. The very fact that we don't even have a definition of Islamophobia is a huge gap in how we deal with that problem, which all your guests have talked about. I think that the thing I would say that we need to consider is that the police are working incredibly hard. I think we need to give credit where credit is due. And the police have worked with local communities and worked with the courts and the government to ensure that we have a good grip on this problem. I think they just need to be continuing that for the next few days. But remember, I've been a riot-trained officer. It's tough. You go into work at 8 o'clock in the morning, you don't come home until 2 o'clock in the morning, and then you'll start again at 8 o'clock the next morning, and you do that for week after week while the disorder's happening. So, a moment just to thank the police for the incredible work they are doing to fight beat the racist, fascists and bring them to justice.
Yeah. Jeremy, despite all the surveys, the studies that have been saying that immigration and diversity are good for the economy, are good for the job market. They have never been a serious threat to Western democracies or to Europe in particular. Yet, that sentiment that immigrants are a threat resonates more stronger than ever among people in the West. Do you think it's about time for politicians themselves to reinvent themselves, to be able to convince people that there is a difference between perceptions and reality, which does not seem to be the case now?
Politicians should stop conceding ground to the right, stop conceding ground to the racists, and stop the blame culture against migrants and refugees. Migrants and refugees did not cause the housing crisis. They didn't cause low wages. Employers caused low wages, and government's lack of investment caused the housing crisis. They also need to look at the way the media constantly demonize particular communities, often the Muslim community, and keep on building up this sense of resentment against them. So there's a role here for the media, for journalists in all places, to think about what they're reporting and the way that they're reporting it. And calling out Islamophobia, and you're quite right, there isn't a definition of Islamophobia, there ought to be one. And so we just need to understand that if we keep on, politicians that is, conceding political ground to the far right, which drags the centre ground further to the right, you then end up with a kind of horror show that we've had over the past week or two in Britain and has happened in many other parts of Europe. If we want to live in a decent, fair society, then you include everybody and you respect everybody at the same time.
Idil, do you think that this is something that could lead the minorities to further isolation in Europe, the UK in particular?
If you speak to Muslim communities today here in the UK, majority of them will tell you that they are scared to go outside. They are scared to go about their daily business, to do their grocery shopping, to take their kids out. I mean, it's summer holidays here, so the kids are at home. They're scared to take their kids out to play in the local parks and go out and enjoy themselves. People are fearful because they've seen the attacks that has been so targeted against them. And so we have this climate of fear now that people are affected by. What we need to do is to really come out in solidarity and support the Muslim communities as well as the migrant communities. And I want to commend all of the faith leaders, the police, the councillors, the local civil society organizations, activists that have really come out in droves last night and the nights before, and I hope that continues to really show solidarity and say we are safe here, you are safe here.
We'll have to unfortunately leave it there. Jeremy Corbyn, Idil Osman, Babu, I really appreciate your time and your insight. Thank you. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem Ahelbarra, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.